Alright, hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So today I wanted to talk about a subject that I've been wanting to cover for so long, and that's essentially my history growing up as a video game collector before I started making videos on YouTube. So I think the most important thing to know is that I was essentially born into a family that was already into video games and very supportive of playing video games, and I think that is the number one contributor as to, how I've ended up being in love with games and collecting games as much as I am today. So what do I mean by this? When I was, 4 or 5 years old, some of my earliest memories of playing video games was because my dad had taken his ColecoVision from when he was a kid and hooked it up in my bedroom on the old, big, large dial tube TV. So that way I had a ColecoVision in my bedroom from a very young age, playing games like Donkey Kong Jr., Congo Bongo, Zaxxon, some of my earliest and fondest memories. And when I used to go to my grandparents' house, they had a Sega Genesis. My grandfather was already a gamer. He was playing PC games like Doom and Wolfenstein, and then, eventually he would start moving on to the PlayStation with Tomb Raider games and such like that. But he was already playing games, so anytime I'd go over to my grandparents' house, there was a Sega Genesis for me to play. When I went over to my other side of the family's home, on my dad's side, I'd go into the basement there, and there was an NES down there for me to play. So I was able to play games like Super Mario and Zelda, and I had exposure to these games from a young age. So it was always fun to go visit family. You know how a lot of kids, when they were younger, it was like, yeah, it was fun to go visit your grandparents. Of course, I didn't, how could you not look forward to that, right? But it was like even elevated to the point where it's like, oh, we're going to grandma and grandpa's house to play some Genesis with grandpa, or oh, we're going to go to, my other grandmother's house and they've got an NES hooked up in the basement with some of the best games. I mean, it was a wonderful childhood, and it's one of the main reasons that I contribute being into games as much as I am, because pretty much my whole family was into playing games. It was really cool. And it really started when I would go to my grandfather's house, grandpa's house, and they would have that Sega Genesis, and I do have a video of this on YouTube. I'll leave a link to it in the description below if you've never seen it. And I'd go there and play Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 1 and 2. I'd play multiplayer Golden Axe. I'd play with my grandpa, I'd play with my dad, depending whoever was over at the time. Spending a weekend at grandpa's was pretty awesome. And my dad started catching wind that, hey, he's really into this Sonic the Hedgehog game. And when I was 7 years old, just turned 7, I got my first ever console of my own, which was the Sega Genesis. And I got a copy of Chakan, the Forever Man. Boy, what an easy game to start playing when I was 7 years old. Boy, was that game difficult. And of course, I got the packet of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 when I was 7. And from there, it was pretty much history. The thing is, having family members that were supportive and into games helped a lot. So oftentimes, when I would go hang out with my grandparents, they were really into going to flea markets. So, flea markets and yard sales, but especially flea markets. And, there was a time where I was going there a couple times a month to go with my grandparents to a local flea market. And, being the nice grandparents that they were, they'd give me a little bit of money each time, and I'd go around and I'd search the booths and pick out some Sega Genesis games, and prowl for the deals even at a young age. I'd walk around with my grandpa. And, they didn't, spoil me or anything, but they'd give me a little bit of money each time. Not a lot, not a whole lot. So I had to be really selective in what I wanted to buy. And sometimes we'd hit up yard sales. And that's pretty much how it snowballed from there, how I started amassing a collection at such a young age, because my grandparents were okay with it. They were into me picking up games, a couple times a month with them out at the flea markets. And, as I got slightly older and, more consoles started coming out, I'd take trips with my dad to places like Funkoland, and we'd look through the Genesis games there, and eventually, once I started getting a Super Nintendo, a couple years after I got my Genesis, eventually Super Nintendo games. And the upside is that my dad at the time was also playing a lot of Genesis games with me, not just multiplayer, but he would play games himself. So there was always the benefit of, okay, you have a dad that's in the gaming, They're not just like buying games for their kid to play, they're buying games because they're playing those games with their kid and also for themselves. So that also helped me amass a nice little collection of games when I was really young. And of course, games were very expensive back then, as they are still now. So we usually focused on bargain bins. For example, when we would go into stores like Electronics Boutique, and especially a local store called The Wiz, which was sort of a northeastern chain, there would always be these little wire rack bins at the end. I vividly remember these bins. We never really, like, we'd go down the aisles of the brand new games, gazing at these, big price ticket games sealed in their cases. It was always cool to see what new games had just came out. But we always focused on the bargain bins. We went straight to these end cap wireframe bins where everything in there was either like returned or used in some way, in some cases new, like overstock that had never sold. And you would just dig through there and find these gems that were so cheap. I mean, how could you pass them up? It was like kid in the candy store, essentially. It's like, hey dad, look at this one. Oh, it's only $5, $10. Get it. Oh, that's multiplayer. Get it. Oh, that one has a cool monster on the cover, like, Zombies Ate My Neighbors, right? It's like, look at that, that's so cool, because I was really in the horror movies, so anything that looked like it was like monsters and horror, it's like, get it, we'll see how it is, because the games were cheap in the bargain bin. And then, as more and more as I started getting older and, had my PlayStation and whatnot, and I'd go into stores like Electronics Boutique, for example, or the beginning years of GameStop, and they would also have used game sections. I had a knack for picking out cheap, good-looking bargain bin games. But let's rewind a little bit here, right? Like, let's get back to the point where I figured out that I was not just buying games to play them, but also essentially collecting games. And this dates back to around, well, I don't know the exact year, but I remember being in a Funko-Land, and I was picking up Kirby's Avalanche on the Super Nintendo. And at the time, what they used to do is they would keep the game boxes on the shelves, and you would bring up the box to the counter and say, I'd like this game, or you would just tell them, because you saw the game box on the shelf, and you would say, I want this game, and then they'd get the cart. They were never like, oh, go grab the box from the shelf, take it with you, none of that kind of stuff. Essentially, you would bring the box up, and I don't even recall them saying to you, oh, do you want to keep the box? They'd pretty much just like take the box, put it behind their counter, give you your game. At least that's how it was for the Funko-Lands that I used to go to. And I remember one time, I saw Kirby's Avalanche, and I said to the guy at the register, I'm like, oh, I'd like Kirby's Avalanche, please. And then I was looking back at the shelf, and I'm like, why wouldn't I want the box to go with it? And I said to the guy at the register, is it okay if I take the box too? And he's like, yeah, sure. I mean, we're just going to throw it out anyway. And it was in that moment, and I still have the original box for Kirby's Avalanche. This is it right here. This box is pretty much solely responsible for me. The moment, like, the moment where I realized that it's not, of course it's about playing the games, but also that collector side in me was like, what about that box? And luckily I realized this from a young age, and, previously all the games I was buying on, like, Sega Genesis and whatnot, I never felt a reason to get rid of the boxes. My parents weren't like, throw them out, they're taking up space. If anything, they were kind of cool to just have in the shelf and a nice, clean way to store the games. So a lot of my original Genesis and, also games like Atari Jaguar and such, we'll get into that a little bit in a moment here. We had no reason to get rid of the boxes. And after I held on to that box from Kirby's Avalanche, I just started fixating on mostly just wanting games with the original boxes, because I think it's also easier for people to understand that grew up with this sort of mindset with me too, where we judged games by the cover. We didn't have YouTube channels to look at. We didn't have gameplay videos to look at. We just had magazines, which, by the way, if you didn't have subscriptions to magazines like me, I didn't really have many subscriptions. A lot of my magazines came from going to a grocery store, going to some kind of like Kmart, Walmart, something like that, and seeing a cool cover on a magazine and picking that up and then looking through it, and that's how I kind of found out about my games. We judged our games by the cover. And I think growing up with judging games purely by their cover and their descriptions on the back and the screenshots on the back and screenshots and box arts and advertisements in magazines, that's what essentially made me appreciate physically owning these boxes and these covers so much more. And some people these days are like, well, what's the big deal? Why do you have to have games complete in box? And yes, there are some consoles where I don't really need it anymore because it's so expensive to collect complete in box these days. I just can't justify it. But for certain consoles like Sega Genesis, it's like, man, I need those boxes because that's how I grew up buying Sega Genesis games, judging them by the covers. It just means so much to me. I also made a video a couple years back about this topic of why collecting complete in box is so important to me, and I'll also link that in the description below if you want to check that out after this video. Now I'm getting off track here. So, yeah, getting that copy of Kirby's Avalanche was pretty much the moment. I don't know how old I was, maybe 9 or 10 or so, where I was like, this is it. I want my games with the box from now on, from there on out, because I made that decision in that moment to go from cart only to with the box. It didn't have the manual, but it was just the box. So let's move ahead a little bit. Well, before we move away from that, let's also talk about, it's not just about the Genesis. I was into consoles like the Atari Jaguar and the Sega 32X, especially the Atari Jaguar. I remember going into an electronics boutique and seeing an end cap with the art for Rayman, the Atari Jaguar box for Rayman, and the colors and the character really spoke to me, and I was like, wow, I really need this console, and I didn't get it right away. My dad waited until it was pretty much on clearance. The Jaguar system itself was like under $100. But eventually I got the Jaguar, and he was really into games like Alien vs. Predator and Power Drive Rally, and we were both into Jaguar together, so it helped. And Theme Park, we loved Theme Park quite a bit on the Jaguar. So we built up a little Jaguar collection, and consoles like the Sega 32X. We weren't buying these when they were brand new. I got my 32X when that was also on clearance. Man, I think the 32X was $49.99. My dad's like, we'll just get it, man. That thing, they're practically throwing those things away. We got that from Toys R Us when they had like this giant pallet, and they couldn't even give the 32Xs away. And I rescued mine, got a copy of, Colibri, Knuckles Chaotix, Star Wars, came with a copy of Virtua Fighter. Man, the 32X was awesome. And eventually I'd get a PlayStation, but by then it's pretty much the era of mostly getting my games from GameStop and Electronics Boutique and going to their used game sections. The little bit of maybe allowance that I had or money. I mean, I'm going to get into the side of eBay and yard selling in a moment here. But that's really when I was hunting for the deals. Most of the games I was buying at the time were anywhere between $5 to $15. But that's when yard sale, garage sale hunting, and flea market visits, became a big portion of how I started amassing a collection. And that was mostly done by, going to yard sales and flea markets weekly, in the case of flea markets, maybe once or twice a month, and hunting for games for a few dollars each. And before eBay, now we're going to get into the side of things where, what did you do as a game collector when eBay wasn't really around quite yet, or was still just kind of coming into fruition? And a lot of that actually at the time for me was sort of done in tandem with eBay, but eBay was still sort of in its infancy. Was through sites like Digital Press, RF Generation, Atari Age. And the moment that I realized that there were other people out there like me, I didn't know, by the way, that video game collecting was a thing until about 2001. So I was about probably 13 at the time. I don't know exactly what month or exactly when I discovered Digital Press's Room of Doom website. I remember browsing the internet, typing in search terms like video game collection or something along those terms. I don't remember how I happened upon it, but I didn't really know that there were other people out there like me that were into putting a bunch of games on a shelf and, obviously playing them, but also appreciating the collectability and the fun in finding games to keep for your collection. Keeping the boxes, seeking the manuals, looking for obscure stuff. outside of just the normal, Sega and Nintendo and PlayStation that was out there, looking into the more obscure consoles that maybe didn't get quite as much love, such as the 32X and the Jaguar. And that's when I happened upon Digital Press's site. It was known as the Room of Doom. It was an extension off of Digital Press, and it was Joe Santulli, the owner of Digital Press's game room. And it was a whole bunch of photos. And I just remember looking at these photos, and I was like, wow, that is amazing. He has a full Sega Genesis, or a full Sega CD collection. He's got a World of Nintendo, Super Nintendo kiosk in the corner of his room surrounded by Atari games and Intellivision games. Just really cool memorabilia, stacks of games, full collections. And I remember looking at this and I was like, oh my goodness, this is like my idol. This is, wow, that's what I aspire to have when I get older. And in that moment, I felt sort of like this acceptance, like, wow, I'm not the only person out there that has this mindset of, filling shelves and bookcases with older retro games. However, the website design was a little weird. I think unless you knew to click on the banner that said Room of Doom, you would have never found the eye-opening experience that I would eventually find about, I think, a year or two later. But at first, I did not realize that it was not just Joe's collection. It was a community of people that would post their collections, pictures of their collection, and a forum with people on it discussing buying games for cheap prices, selling games. There was a marketplace where we can buy and sell with other people, a place to discuss, what games to look out for on a certain system. And after I had discovered that there was more to the Room of Doom website than just this one person's collection, my eyes were opened to the world of video game collecting, essentially, where it had previously sort of been in this small shell. Now there was this group of people that I can admire their collections, gain inspiration, see how they have their room set up. There was also a small subsection of the site, which I don't even know if it's even up anymore or how to access it, where people would actually film their game collections on like VHS and upload it to the site, and it would take a long time to download. And it was this real world glimpse and looks into certain people's rooms, and only a few people did this, but it was mostly the pictures. The pictures told such a story as to what kind of games people are into. Oh, look at that piece of merchandise. Where did they get that Nintendo sign? That's so cool. Look at how they have those shelves set up with the games flanking on both sides, and how they have the little figure tucked in the middle of it. Such inspirational ways to see somebody's personality through their collection. You kind of got a sense for what kind of games they were into just looking at their photos, and it was really fun. And then you would go onto the forums and you would get to know these people more. You would connect with them. You'd see the kind of posts they made. Some people focused on reviewing games. Some people focused on overviews of consoles, what they recommend for it. When it comes to the collecting side of things, however, the buying and selling marketplace on Digital Press's forum was definitely a good jumpstart for me to get into the economics of growing a game collection in a way that was not too expensive. And what do I mean by this? There was a sort of prowling that would go on. You would spend hours a day on the marketplace waiting for people to post their threads, and essentially how it would work is they would just list the games, the name of the game, with the prices next to it, or best offer, say, send me whatever your best offer is, or maybe they'd take some photos of what they had for sale. And I would go through people's list of games, and in some cases you would make bundle deals and get stuff for practically next to nothing. So I would take these games that, I'd find at yard sales, and maybe I had doubles of, going to a yard sale and finding a stack of 20 N64 carts for a couple bucks each. Suddenly, the doubles that I had, or games that I would, get from Blockbuster in the used games section for next to nothing that I really didn't want anymore, suddenly were great trade fodder, or good selling fodder to then go on the digital press and use to trade with people, or to sell and essentially take that and buy something from somebody else. Just to put this into perspective, we're talking about a time where I got my original copy of Panzer Dragoon Saga from the Digital Press forum from somebody that was asking $120 for a complete in-box Panzer Dragoon Saga, just to kind of set the scene as to what prices were like back then. And it didn't even instantly sell. I just remember messaging the person, and they took the offer, and at the time, that was the most I had ever spent on a game, and, took quite a bit of saving up from other games to be able to get that, and it was a big investment, but I guess it paid off, right? It's still in my collection, and it has gone up in price just a little bit. But that was pretty much my life collecting before I really dove into the eBay side of things, using sites like Digital Press. RF Generation was another one that had a marketplace similar to Digital Press, as well as Atari Age, though I didn't use them quite as much for the outside of the marketplace. I didn't really post in the community side of things there. But Atari Age was another one where I used the forums for seeing what people were buying and selling. And in some cases, people were selling stuff that would go on to become really expensive games, because I had that knack of finding those titles that looked odd, a little different, a little appealing. And sure enough, that's why so many games on my collection now are worth so much, because I had this knack for picking out oddball titles that were pretty uncommon and were pretty rare. Before we move away from Digital Press to another resource that I used to use for collecting prior to the resources that we have today, they had a Rarity guide on their website, which was this big database that you can go to, and they would list all the games. Essentially, it was community run, but they would list games for every system, all the games released for that console, a rarity rating, and in the case of their guides, which they eventually published, physical compendiums of these price guides and rarity guides, and boy did I study those things. I had and still have both Digital Press books, which are like this thick, really thick books, where they would go through and list every game released for that console, an approximate rarity judged by the community or the staff that would put together these books, an approximate value, maybe a little blurb about the game, and I would go through and I would study each game. Okay, why is this game rare? Let's try and find out why. Why is this game so much money? Let's find out why. That way, when I started using eBay more in the early 2000s, I was able to pick out these games that for some reason were really hard to find. People were saying, hey, I have a really hard time finding this game in the wild. It's really hard to find online or in people's trade boxes from what I can see. Let's mark it a rarity 7 out of 10. And I would keep my eye out for these games, so that way if I ever saw one pop up on eBay really cheap, one of my first purchases on eBay was Klonoa Door to Phantomile. Picked that up because good game, pretty obscure, not a lot of people were talking about it, and look at it now, that game is like over $200, right? So that's sort of the knack that I had in the beginning of picking out these games, and it helped that I was really, really into platformers, really into RPGs eventually once I warmed up to the genre. I didn't play sports games, really. I was into monsters and sci-fi and fantasy, which tend to be games that lean towards the more obscure, rare, hard-to-find side. So I sort of had this benefit of luckily being into games that these days are really hard to track down. From there, I'm trying to go through in my mind. I didn't script any of this out, so I'm trying to go through everything here. From there, it pretty much just boiled down to looking on eBay for lots, right? How to amass a collection, right, back in the day. So what I started doing was I would go on eBay, and instead of just buying games individually, I'd start looking at lots, bulk lots. People getting rid of their collection, people getting rid of a little stack of their games, and I would go through these lots, and I would spend the time to look through at every individual title, added up approximate value. Okay, this game is worth $5, this game is worth $10, this one is worth $20. I have this game already, I don't have that one, I'm going to keep that one, I have no interest in this one, I'll use that as trade bait, maybe I'll get rid of this one. So when I would buy a lot, I would essentially add games to my collection for free. Because at the time, not a lot of people were running. You have to remember, back then, people didn't have these independent game stores, right? There weren't people that made a living by buying and selling games through an eBay store or having a storefront. That was not really prevalent back then. It was very rare. A lot of the stores back then were just the big, company-wide GameStops, electronics boutiques, stuff like that. So when somebody would list a collection for sale, most people were, not as pouncy as they are now. Now, if a collection is listed on eBay, it gets listed, and within 30 seconds it's already been viewed like 30 or 40 times, because there's a lot of people out there prowling for their storefront or for their collection, or for the reason that I used to do it back then, to sort of trade out pieces and keep certain stuff, get rid of certain stuff. But back then it wasn't as competitive, so you can get a large lot for next to nothing, right? A good example is when I decided to get into 3DO when I was like 13 or 14 years old. I picked up a 3DO with a game really cheap from some guy. I think I got it from RF Generation, if I remember right, RF Generation or Digital Press's forums. Somebody was getting rid of their 3DO with a couple of games, and I think I got it for like $100 shipped or something like that. Once I had my 3DO, how did I get my games? I found a lot on eBay, and I actually found my original receipt in my old email because I wanted to confirm this. I paid $350 shipped for 60 complete in-box, long box 3DO games. Back then, nobody cared about 3DO, right? Those games, there were games in that lot now that are worth half the price of the entire lot by themselves for 3DO. But back then, nobody cared. But by buying these lots, it allowed me to get these really large collections. And in the case of 3DO, that's one that I held on to. I didn't get piece out any of those games. Virtual Boy, I got almost a complete in-box Virtual Boy collection in one fell swoop for like $250, I think it was. I got a Virtual Boy and almost every game on the console, complete in box with the exception of just a handful. It didn't include Waterworld, 3D Tetris, and like one or two others like golf or something, but it came with games like Jack Brothers complete in the box. It came with pretty much every other game in the console library complete in box for, I think it was $250 to $300, right? And that's how eBay was back then. Jack Brothers for example, just to get that game cart only is almost the entire price that I paid for that lot. But for PlayStation, Super Nintendo, Genesis, if I bought a lot of 5 games, I'd be able to make my money back in trading, or at least take one game that I don't need or want and swap it for another one with somebody on a forum, or sell it on eBay. And also at the time, I decided that I was just going to dedicate everything to game collecting. I sold off pretty much every other hobby I was into. I got rid of all my Pokemon collectibles, all my Pokemon cards. I got rid of a lot of my childhood toys, which I do regret getting rid of most of the toys that I grew up from my childhood, because some of those are pretty nostalgic for me now. But I was so obsessed with this idea of finding ways to fund my video game collection. But most of it was done, in a non-volatile way. Just, it's not like I was investing tons into it because I was always getting it back, going to garage sales, going to flea markets. I used to find like boxes of consoles. There was this one yard sale I went to where there was a box of like 5 NESs, a couple Genesis in there, and they only wanted $5 or $10 for it. Stuff like that. You use that to trade with other people. Like, hey, I'll give you a Genesis and a Nintendo for your, I don't know, your Game Boy or your Game Gear or something like that, right? Like, that was how things worked back then. There was a real sense of community between game collectors because we felt like we were few and far between, and there weren't a terrible amount of us. And we sort of felt, this sense of, it wasn't very backstabbing in a way, right? Like, if somebody got a really good deal and shared it, nobody was like, darn, I wish I got that before you, or something like it. Everybody was very supportive over one another and their game collections. If you posted a collection and it didn't really have a ton of games, people were still very encouraging. They'd say, wow, great collection, great start. And at the time, I was one of the younger members on Digital Press, for example. A lot of people on there were already in their 20s, 30s, 40s, or older, and I was, in my teens, and it sort of felt very accepting, People were very accepting of a younger teenage collector back in the day. And that's pretty much where we come to, right? It's just to rewind, growing up with family members that were already into games, very supportive of games, going to yard sales, getting games for next to nothing, finding that sense of community with other people that did the same thing that you do on the internet, finding eBay before it sort of became this big boom of competition for collecting retro games, and being able to pretty much take advantage of the fact that people were practically giving away games on that website So if you knew how to use it back then, boy, you can get some crazy deals on there, which is not really the case so much anymore. And pretty much dedicating my life to playing games helped as well. Not having too many other hobbies, no regrets whatsoever, because look where it's got me now, right? Like it's really amazing how far I've come in terms of being able to get my opinions. One thing I've always wanted to do is get my opinions out there on the games I was playing, and I tried so many avenues, such as making fan sites, websites for reviewing games, doing solo podcasts, I even had times where I was going to do like a fanzine where I print my own magazines and ship them out to people. So finally being able to find that avenue through YouTube and then eventually through live streaming to get my opinions out there through games, well, I accomplished what I set out to do all those years ago, right? Being able to share my love and passion for games. Anyway, I'm sure there's some stuff that I may have forgotten about. Like I said, I kind of just sat down and said, let's do it, let's talk about this. So if any of you ever want to share how you got started collecting games and whatnot, feel free to leave a comment below, or you can just come and chat with me the next time I'm streaming. I'd love to hear about, how you got started collecting games. Did you have a similar experience? Was your family supportive of your collecting habits? Did you have people in your family that played with you? What do they think of it now? I'd be really interested to know. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Feels good to be back. Would you guys believe 4 weeks in a row with posting a video on YouTube? Oh, it feels so refreshing. But it's mostly due to your support. I'm going to keep posting videos as long as you guys keep enjoying them and keep the positive comments up, and I'll keep making it. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.